When we picture ancient Rome, we think of the incredible architecture, the unstoppable legions, the sheer scale of it all. But beneath that gleaming marble facade was a foundation built on something incredibly dark. Today, we're diving into how Rome transformed into a society utterly dependent on the systematic exploitation of human beings.
This wasn't just some grim historical accident. What the research really shows us is that Rome's journey into a slave society was a deliberate process. It was built piece by piece, through a series of interlocking causes that we can actually track over time.
And that really gets us to the heart of the matter. You see, historians like Keith Bradley and Paul Cartledge make a critical distinction here. There's a world of difference between a society that has some enslaved people and what they call a genuine slave society. In the second one, enslaved labor isn't just present, it's the very engine of the entire economy. So the big question is, how did Rome make that leap?
To figure that out, we're going to unpack 6 interconnected causes. Think of it as a kind of perfect storm, a moment where all these legal, political, military, and economic forces converged to create one of the most intensive slave economies the world has ever seen.
So, our story doesn't begin on some far-flung battlefield. Nope, it starts right inside Rome itself. Because long before Romans were enslaving foreigners by the thousands, they had a system for forcing their own citizens into a state of bondage. This early system was called Nexum. The legal historian W. Buckland breaks it down for us. It was basically a form of debt bondage. If you were a Roman citizen and you couldn't pay back a loan, you could literally pledge your own body as collateral. You were then forced to work for your creditor until the debt was paid. Okay, so this is a really crucial distinction to understand. On paper, the nexus, or the debt bondsman, was still technically a Roman citizen. He wasn't property like a service or slave would later be. But what about in his daily life? Well, he could still be forced to work. He could be physically punished. In reality, his freedom was what we might call a legal fiction. He was free in name only. As you can probably guess, this whole system created huge social unrest. The historian Keith Hopkins points to it as one of the main drivers of the famous conflict of the orders between the rich patricians and the common plebeians. It all came to a boil in 326 BC, when a law was passed that finally abolished Nexum. Now, this was a massive win for Roman citizens, but it created a brand new problem for the ruling class. Where were they going to get their cheap labor now? And that's when they started looking outward. So that internal source of forced labor is now off the table. And right around the same time, a major political change happens that, almost by accident, sets the stage for a new, external source to take its place. We're talking about the Lex Hortensia of 287 BC. This law effectively ended that long-running political strife by giving the plebeian assembly real legislative power. It created a much more unified Roman state. Now, on the surface, this might seem like it has absolutely nothing to do with slavery, but its knock-on effects were enormous. The connections might be indirect, but they are absolutely critical. First, as Hopkins argues, this new political unity is what finally allowed Rome to get serious about empire building, to launch those huge, sustained military campaigns. And second, as M.I. Finley points out, by cementing the rights of what it meant to be a Roman citizen, this law drew a very sharp line in the sand. On one side, you had the free Roman, whose body was now legally protected, and on the other, well, you had the foreign outsider, who is now considered fair game. And that brings us to the engine itself. With all that internal political turmoil settled, Rome's war machine could finally kick into high gear. And it was this machine that would provide the raw human material for its booming slave economy. The numbers here are just staggering. According to Keith Hopkins, when Rome destroyed just 2 cities, Carthage and Corinth, in the same year, 1460 BC, it flooded the Italian slave market with hundreds of thousands of captives. And this wasn't some one-off event. This became the standard operating procedure of Roman expansion. And the Romans had a really chilling justification for all of this. As Keith Bradley explains, their very word for slave, servi, was believed to come from the verb servare, which means to preserve. The logic went like this: a Roman general had the absolute right to execute every single person he captured in battle. So by choosing to enslave them instead, he was, in a twisted way, preserving their lives. And the price for this act of so-called mercy? A lifetime of servitude. And here we come to the great tragic paradox in this whole story. The very same wars that were supplying this massive number of enslaved people were also, at the exact same time, destroying the class of free Roman farmers, which, in turn,
created the demand for all that slave labor.
It was a truly cruel cycle, and Keith Hopkins lays it out perfectly. A citizen farmer gets called up to serve in the army for years at a time, often overseas. While he's gone, his small farm back home gets neglected and falls into debt. When he finally returns, he's often broke and can't pay what he owes, so his land gets seized by a wealthy creditor. And the final bitter irony? The now landless farmer is replaced on his own land by the very captives he helped to enslave on the battlefield. I mean, this quote from Hopkins just hits the nail on the head. He says, the Roman soldier effectively fought for his own economic displacement. In fighting to expand the Republic, he was, in a very real way, fighting to destroy his own way of life. Okay, let's just quickly take stock. We have a massive, seemingly endless supply of enslaved labor from warfare. We have huge amounts of land being freed up as small farmers lose their property. The last piece of this economic puzzle is figuring out what the Roman elite did with the obscene amounts of wealth they were pulling in from their new empire.
Well, according to the historian M.I. Finley, we have to remember, this is a pre-industrial economy. If you were a Roman aristocrat with a mountain of cash from war booty, what were your investment options? There was really only one safe, prestigious bet: land. Land was the ultimate source of wealth, social status, and political power, so nearly all that money from conquest went straight into buying up Italian real estate. And this is what gives rise to the Latifundia, these enormous agricultural estates. We're not talking about your charming little family farms. These were basically industrial-scale plantations specializing in cash crops like wine and olive oil. And to be profitable, they needed a huge, permanent, and totally controllable workforce. Only large gangs of enslaved people could provide that. So, that covers a how. We see all the pieces falling into place. But for our final point, we really have to ask why. Why did Rome commit so completely to this economic model? The answer, it turns out, is deeply tied to the political logic of the Republic, which had to find a way to balance its ideals of citizen freedom with the harsh reality of massive wealth inequality. Just think about it. The Roman elite couldn't treat their fellow citizens, the very people who fought in their armies and voted in elections, as disposable tools without sparking a full-blown revolution. So what was the solution? They directed the most brutal forms of exploitation onto foreign outsiders, people who were seen as completely separate from the civic community. And nothing captures this better than the horrifying legal term for an enslaved person, instrumentum vocale, a tool that talks. They weren't people, they were living, breathing pieces of farm equipment. But here's the catch. This political fix had a fatal contradiction baked right in. Sure, enslaving foreigners might have kept the peace between rich and poor Roman citizens in the short term, but it did nothing to solve the underlying problems of land concentration and poverty. In fact, it just made them worse. It was a solution that, in the long run, only fueled the very crises that would eventually tear the Republic apart. So, to bring it all together, the rise of mass slavery in Rome really was a perfect storm. Getting rid of internal debt bondage created the demand. Political unity enabled the wars that created the supply. Those same wars pushed free farmers off their land, creating the need. And the profits of empire funded the whole system, all of it, held together by a political logic that protected citizens by dehumanizing and exploiting everyone else. Every single one of these pieces was essential. Together, they tell the story of how a republic's laws, its wars, and its own internal inequalities combined to create a system of bondage that would define it for centuries. It really forces us to grapple with a tough question. How often in history has the freedom of one group been bought at the price of the total unfreedom of another?